I want to welcome you all to this seminar. How can we increase international cooperation on impunity? On account and to attribute to Mrs. Norma Andrade's life and her fight for justice after her daughter was murdered in 2001. A fight not only about justice in her daughter's case, but for all women that are killed in Mexico just because they are women. And that is called now femicide. And the issue of impunity is very relevant when it comes to access to justice in Mexico and elsewhere. Mrs. Norma Andrade from Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico, is the laureate of the 2022 Edelstam Prize. And I suggest we give her a warm applause for her and her tireless and courageous work for access to justice. And we will hear about Norma's life and her fight for justice and the rule of law during the seminar. I would like to say a few words about the prize. The Edelstam Prize is a Sweden-based international monetary award administered by the Harald Edelstam Foundation. The Edelstam Prize is awarded for outstanding contributions and exceptional courage in standing up for one's beliefs in the defense of human rights. The Edelstam Prize is named after and awarded in the memory of the Swedish diplomat and ambassador Harald Edelstam. Harald Edelstam distinguished himself as diplomat by his professional competence, his bravery, and his civic courage in the fight for human rights. He was an early proponent and symbol of what is today known as the responsibility to protect, and his memorable acts contributed to save more than 1,000 lives. And finally, of course, I also want to thank Etnografiska Museet for letting us be here today. And now I leave the floor to Hans Corell. Among other tasks, former Under-Secretary General for Legal Affairs and the Legal Council of the United Nations, who is going to moderate the seminar. So the floor is yours.
Very good. Thank you for inviting me to moderate this ceremony. It's a great pleasure to do so. And let me also forward my warmest congratulations to the prize winner, Norma Esther Andrade. I read the information about you with great respect and admiration, and I look forward to listening to you in the discussion. I'm sure you have seen the program here, so my task is to moderate the discussion. But the discussion will not take place until after all the specially invited speakers have said what they want to say. And in the program, there is Katarina Bergerhed. Unfortunately, she has fallen ill, so she won't come. But the other speakers are here. So I would like now to ask the prize winner, Norma Esther Andrade, to take the floor and to speak to us. You were invited. Thank you.
Buenas tardes a todos. Gracias a la Fundación por la invitación, por el reconocimiento.
Okay, so good evening to everybody, and thanks for having me here today. So I'm French, so you have to bear with my Molière accent, okay? But okay, I'm trying my best to translate what she's going to say.
Si alguno de los aquí presentes algún día va a Ciudad Juárez,
So if
Chihuahua, México,
if one of you go to Ciudad Juárez once,
dos cosas les llamarán la atención.
two things are going to take your interest, attention. Thank you.
Líneas rojas pintadas en el piso y cruces
Okay, so pink lines on the floor and some crosses as well.
y cruces rosas, perdón, con fondo negro pintadas en los postes.
Okay, and red crosses with a black whatever, black backdrop.
Líneas rojas pintadas en el suelo, se preguntarán.
So why do we have some red lines on the floor?
Fueron pintadas por antiguas administraciones
They were painted by previous administration
para avisarnos a los juarenses que no cruzáramos por ahí porque el piso se podría abrir como socavón cuando llovía.
Okay, so those lines were actually built for alerting people that the flow could actually be flooded, I think, or destroyed by the flood.
Mucha gente murió ahí,
So many people were killed,
pero ya nadie se acuerda de ello.
but nobody remembered that.
Y sucesivas administraciones han tratado de borrarlas.
So many administration have tried to actually delete all that, all those lines,
Así con las cruces rosas,
and the red crosses as well.
ya desgastadas con el tiempo, porque nosotras vamos a pintarlas pues, cuando tenemos dinero o cuando podemos de vez en cuando.
Okay, so she's saying that all these things, they were the symbols of, their fight actually, were completely destroyed. So now they need money to rebuild them.
Así como las líneas rojas, ya nadie se acuerda de lo que significan,
Because
también
nobody,
nuestras cruces rosas.
because nobody remember what is the right meaning of those lines and the crosses. And for them it was very important.
Las jóvenes de nuestra ciudad saben que algo terrorífico pasó en la ciudad, lo ven como un cuento.
So many girls in Juarez, that they see that and they remember that something bad happened, but they cannot really figure out, what it was.
Sin saber que muchas de ellas actualmente están viviendo esas historias.
And they probably don't know that it's still, currently the case. Okay, they think it's happened in the past, but it's still happening now.
Jóvenes que son desaparecidas,
Women that are disappearing,
privadas de su libertad,
their freedom are taken,
torturadas, violentadas
So-
y finalmente asesinadas y arrojadas a un lote baldío.
so there are many women today who are tortured, violated, raped and everything, and people do not know. Those girls may not know.
De eso ya nadie habla.
So nobody's talking about it.
Nadie quiere pertenecer a la minoría que somos nosotras las madres.
So nobody wants to belong to the minority of women and mothers that she belongs to.
Y a nuestra lucha.
This is our fight.
Así que si alguna vez ustedes tienen oportunidad
So if you have an opportunity
de ir a Ciudad
to
Juárez,
go to Ciudad Juarez,
los invito
I invite you.
y cuando vean esas cruces rosas,
And when you're going to
Con
see
fondo
these red
negro.
crosses with this black backdrop,
recuerden que es un mensaje para nuestras autoridades y para toda la sociedad
so remember that this is a message for all the authorities and
de que nuestras hijas
the government.
eran una vida, un
Because-
ser humano,
Because each cross means that there was a human being and that was a woman that has been killed. And this is the representation of a woman that has been killed.
que tenían una familia
They had a family
y que su vida fue truncada
and
cruelmente.
their life were completely taken away very brutally.
A raíz de esta lucha,
With my fight, or our fight,
me vi obligada a desplazarme de la ciudad en la que yo nací.
I was obliged to be displaced from Ciudad Juarez because now I'm forced to live in Mexico City.
En diciembre del 2011
In December 2011,
trataron de matarme.
they tried to kill me.
Me dieron 5 balazos.
I received 5 bullets.
Uno de ellos
One of them
se quedó alojado a 10 grados de mi corazón.
So the one bullet was really close to her heart, like so 10 grados. Okay, what is
10
that?
grados.
So yes, 10 grados. 10 was it said centimeters? I don't know. Are you saying centimeters? Millimeters. Millimeters. Good.
Millimeters.
Not good in mathematics, so that's why. Okay,
Pero ni por eso me van a callar.
but not even with this reason, I'm not going to shut them. I mean to stop crying and shouting.
Porque no me mataron a un perro.
Because they didn't kill my dog.
Me mataron a mi hija.
They killed my daughter.
Y de aquí a que yo muera,
And till I'm dead,
voy a seguir exigiendo justicia.
I'm going to seek justice.
Ni una asesinada más.
And not one anymore. More. Not one more death.
De Juárez a Chiapas,
From Juarez to Chiapas,
ganaremos esta lucha,
we're going to win this fight.
cueste lo que cueste.
No matter what it costs.
Porque no queremos a otra madre, a otra familia,
Because we don't want another mother, another family
llorando como nosotros.
to cry as I'm doing.
Hemos logrado, como una organización,
As an organization, we have succeeded in
no sé cómo lo vas a decir, la tipificación del feminicidio.
the typification of femicide. I don't know if it makes sense for
Para
you.
que,
The codification, maybe codification of feminicide.
para que la muerte de una joven, la muerte violenta de una mujer,
So each woman who is killed violently.
sea penalizado como feminicidio.
So so each murder of a woman that has been killed violently is actually penalized.
De feminicidio se define
Femicide or feminicide, because I don't even know if we say feminicide or femicide, but I think I would say feminicide.
como la muerte por un crimen de odio.
Yeah, because it's really a crime of hate.
Y a raíz de la sentencia de Campo Algodonero,
So after the cotton field case, in which year was it? In qué año?
2009. La sentencia fue en 2009.
Okay, so after the sentence that was given in Mexico in 2009 about the cotton field, I mean the campo de algodonero,
Se le ordenó al Estado mexicano que hiciera sus cambios en las leyes.
so the government was actually asked to change the laws and do something about it. It was sentenced, about the feminicides.
Pero no es suficiente.
But it's not enough,
Siguen asesinando 11 mujeres por día en mi país.
because every day more than 11 women are killed in Mexico.
Entonces, yo les pido
So I'm asking you, I'm begging you,
a las Naciones Unidas
las Naciones,
Amnesty,
to the
¿verdad?
Amnesty International,
para que se pronuncien y le digan al Estado mexicano que tiene que generar política pública que realmente proteja a las mujeres.
So I'm asking you, all of you, to act and ask the government of Mexico to do something so we can actually stop, the pandemic of feminicide in Mexico.
Gracias. Y volvemos a lo mismo. Inga Flera.
Ni una más.
It's really terrible to hear these stories, and I read also the information that the jury had received when they came to the price. It's so sad, in particular since I've had very good contacts with a legal advisor in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Mexico, When I became the legal advisor in the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1984, in the 1980s, I contacted my colleagues in Poland, Mexico, Canada, and India in order to coordinate meetings among the legal advisors of the foreign ministers around the world at the United Nations General Assembly. So I was so disappointed to receive this news from Mexico. And also I represented Secretary General Kofi Annan in Merida in Mexico in December 2003, when we signed the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. So I really hope that this will be stopped and we will have a different development. And once more, warmest congratulations. If you look at the program now, we have a very famous guest here who will address us from Spain, namely Dr. Carlos Castresana Fernandez. And he is actually a former board member of the Edelstam Foundation and an author of the lawsuit before the Spanish Auditoría Nacional, which brought Pinochet to justice. Mr. Castresana is also former head of the International Convention Against Impunity in Guatemala. And this was an organization, he was this from 2007 to 2010. And this was actually created in 2007 in an agreement between the Secretary General of the United Nations and the government of Guatemala. Now, Mr. Carlos Castresana, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Hans Corell. Good afternoon, everyone. I assume you can hear me, if you don't tell me otherwise. Thank you, Caroline Edelstam and the Edelstam Foundation for the opportunity to be here today with all of you talking about impunity, which is one of our concerns long time ago. We always try to find a solution to this very serious problem. We try to find new avenues for justice, for the better protection of victims, but I cannot begin to explain my point of view about impunity and specifically the case of Campo Algodonero, the cotton field, without telling, first of all, congratulations to Norma Andrade for all this very, very deserved prize. She has been a fighter for justice for many, many years. She's widely known not only in Mexico, but in all Latin America and all around the world, because she's a symbol of civic courage, because she has been able to make her personal case, her personal tragedy into a collective fight for justice and especially for the better protection of women all around the world, and bringing to the criminal code this new offense of femicide, which is basically, as she has very clearly explained, the murder of women just because they are women, a hate crime that has to be addressed with a gender perspective if we are trying to be successful. So, felicidades, Norma, por tu premio tan merecido. Un abrazo fuerte. Now, let's go to the case. What is impunity? Impunity is basically the black hole of our justice. We lose our victims through this hole because we are unable to protect them. We have the law, we have the security and justice system, we have policemen, prosecutors, judges, the penitentiary system, but still we fail. Then the question is why we fail? And she has told also, basically because of political will, because those who must give the instruments, the equipment, the personnel, the budget, and all the measures to be taken in order to enable the protection of potential victims don't do the job And as a consequence, the systems are collapsed or are infiltrated in the case of organized crime, and they are unwilling, the authorities and the institutions are unable to provide this protection. The worst consequence of impunity is not only the lack of justice for victims, but the denial of prevention, because a crime that is not punished is an invitation to the repetition of this crime. And this is what has happened as a paradigmatical case in Mexico for many, many years with the women that are being kidnapped, tortured, raped, and murdered. And this is what I began to take care in 2003 when I was sent by the UNODC, the Office of Crime from the United Nations in Vienna, to investigate the investigators. After 400 cases that were at the time, today, unfortunately, there are several thousands of cases, we had to investigate why the security and justice system in Mexico failed to protect the women and then left them absolutely unprotected. And we investigated it. In 2003, we focused on the case of Campo Algodonero, and I will tell why now, the cotton field case, and it became, after a number of years, a case in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. The judgment that has been mentioned previously is the judgment of the Inter-American Court in the case 12,498, the cotton field. The Campo Algodonero is not properly a cotton field, had been a cotton field many, many years ago, but at the time of the fact was a barren land surrounded by square land, surrounded by 4 roads in the industrial area of Ciudad Juárez. And you need to imagine Ciudad Juárez as a very populated city just in the border of Mexico with the United States. Across the river, it is El Paso, Texas, and there are like 2 million people living there, and half of them do not belong there. They are coming from other areas in Mexico, from all Latin America, especially Central America, and there are many women because there are a lot of factories that require female workers in this kind of assembly task for the American industry, the most expensive and most needed from men or women is established there, enormous factories where women work. In many cases, all this population that comes from other areas live in neighborhoods absolutely unprotected, without electric light, without any kind of public services. They need to work, these women, by night, and they need to cross all the city absolutely unprotected and as a potential victim for aggressors, individual or organized aggressors. In this case, in 2001, it was discovered that in this abandoned land, the Campo Algodonero, 8 corpses had been found. 8 corpses, all of them of young women. There was a scandal, there was a lot of public opinion pressure on the authorities, and they decided to do something, and they decided to arrest 2 men, 2 bus drivers that they said were those responsible of the 8 crimes. And this is what happens when the authorities do not make their job properly, because we have clear standards internationally what have to be done when a corpse is discovered. You need to identify the victim, you need to isolate the crime scene, you need to preserve, to collect and preserve properly the evidence, you need to make the autopsy, interrogate the witnesses, and establish all the necessary circumstances for the administration of justice. So the technical standards are very clear. The necessity of trained professional services is also very clear. These cases have to be investigated with a focus in gender, with a gender perspective. Torture for those suspects arrested is obviously prohibited, and it is the most important part. Access and participation to victims and to next of kin of victims have to be granted, because if not, it happens what happened in this case. I have said that 8 young women murdered have been found in the place. 2 men were arrested, and immediately after 1 or 2 days under the police supervision, they confessed, and they recognized that they had kidnapped and murdered and killed and raped and killed these women. They have abandoned the bodies in this lot, in this land, because it was a proper place to abandon and eliminate the evidence of the crime. It was also found and identified a car where they should have theoretically conducted the bodies after raping and killing the women and thrown them in the land, and no forensic investigation was made in the car. No DNA was taken in the bodies, but still the 2 men were in confession of the 8 murderers and identified the 8 supposed victims that they had killed. And when they came to court, they had clear symptoms of having been tortured. They denied the confession. They said it has been taken by the police only under violence. Some of the symptoms one of them had were as clear as the genitals burned, but still the judges didn't take into consideration these circumstances. They sent them to jail. The case was considered solved, and they were sent to trial. Then one of the 2 men, died in jail, and nobody investigated how or why. Then the counsel, the lawyer that had taken the defense, was also murdered by the police in the street, and nobody investigated if the murder of this lawyer that supposedly was a fugitive, according to the police, had any relation with the case he was defending. Finally, the survivor went to trial and he was convicted to 50 years. During the appeal, it was discovered that the circumstances in which the other one defendant had died in prison were very suspecting that it has been an extrajudicial execution. The lawyer has been also extrajudicially executed, and the most important part, torture was proved for the 2 defendants, and 7 after the DNA test was made and came, the result was that 7 of the 8 victims were not the women that supposedly in the confession the suspected had identified as the victims. So it was completely a prefabricated case, and this is the case that was brought to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Not because of the murders, not because of the conviction, but because of the lack of proper investigation of the murder of women. And this is because the international responsibility of Mexico was declared, and the instructions were clear. You need to improve your legislation, and you need to improve the performance of your security and justice system. You cannot ignore torture when it happens. You cannot investigate with the basics of scientific evidence that are available to any authority nowadays. So you need to do your work properly for women having a better protection. This is the fight that Norma Andrade addressed from the civil society side, and it is enormously important in all these cases, because without the pressure from the public opinion, the civil society and the media on the authorities, they will always file under the stronger pressure of organized crime groups. many of these cases in Ciudad Juárez at the time were a consequence of the prevalence of the cartel of Ciudad Juárez, a very powerful organization dedicated to smuggle, obviously, drugs, but also smuggling human beings in the border between Mexico and the United States. So the lesson to be learned of this experience is we have standards. These standards have to be followed. And for the authorities, in these cases where they are making front to very serious criminal organizations, there must be an equivalent pressure from the civil society organizations in order for the authorities to do their job. This is something I will not take a lot of more time, but I wanted to mention two other examples. The Guatemala case, when I was the commissioner against impunity in Guatemala, I was appointed, as Hans Corell has mentioned, in 2007. And we arrived there, and it was a very similar situation to what I have just described in Ciudad Juárez. They had been in civil war for 36 years, and they had a virtually collapsed security and justice system and infiltrated by the groups of organized crime. It was useless, but you cannot feel that you cannot work with them. You need to be humble when you cooperate in international justice, trying to build the capacity they have not and to build the willingness they have not. And it can be made, and it is the example in Guatemala. We had to train young policemen. We selected 100 of them from the police academy. We trained them in investigation, in using their weapons, in driving the cars and everything. And they did the job. Then we selected also young prosecutors, and they did the job when we were able to give them the proper conditions, because they had not equipment, they had not protection, they were scared always of possible retaliations to their families. We took care of the families, and they did the job. So we had policemen, we had prosecutors, we had to create a special court with jurisdiction in all the country based in Guatemala City to provide also protection for the judges, and then the situation began to change. And from a situation of 98% of impunity, we arrived to a situation of 100% of convictions. But for this, we had to remove the political obstacles. 2 attorney generals had to be dismissed consecutively. We have to dismiss the national director and deputy director of the police, and we had to indict those that are supposedly untouchable, for people seeing that the effort for justice was serious. We indicted members of the Congress, members of the government, members of the army, powerful businessmen, so the kind of people that have never been a subject of criminal proceedings. And when people began to see that they could be tried and convicted, they began to believe that a different country was possible. It was with an enormous effort of being present in the media, with an enormous effort of lobbying with the domestic authorities, with the UN, with the embassies of the countries that were donors in this extremely important effort, and then finally persuaded the civil society to organize themselves and to support our efforts. And this way, we were able to balance the situation when our cases were brought to justice because the defendants were very powerful people and they had the capacity to put a lot of pressure on the judges, but we were able also to put an equivalent pressure from the civil society, the families of the victims, the civil organizations that were asking for justice. And this is the lesson to be learned also, that ability and willingness in the terms of the Rome Statute can be built, even in the most unexpected places. And finally, coming to the situation in the International Criminal Court, I have no more time, but maybe we can address this issue in the debate after the other interventions. The Rome Statute was established in 1998 in a time of like honeymoon in the international community. The war, the Cold War had ended 1 decade before, and the war on terror had not begun until 2001. At the time, it was able to approve the Rome Statute to create the International Criminal Court with two basic tools for the member states. First, the budget. The states can control the court because they can decide how much money the court will have available to do the investigations and the trial. The member states also elect the judges and the prosecutors, so it is a very important tool. But most importantly, for the cooperation and the result of effectively combating impunity and establishing accountability, in my view, is that the court and the prosecutor have an enormously important jurisdiction of the most serious crimes without any kind of immunity before them, but at the same time, the prosecutor has not the tools because cannot properly investigate, cannot wiretap, cannot arrest anyone, cannot freeze assets, cannot confiscate any kind of goods, cannot, other than send the warrants for the arrest of those suspects that had to be sent to the court, but they cannot arrest them. So the question relies again in the member state. The International Criminal Court will be not successful unless we are able to create a much better situation in the member states, cooperating with the investigations, doing the proper forensic work, because the prosecutor office has not the specialists. Now, some kind of this cooperation seems to be being done in Ukraine, but the ICC will fail in Ukraine if there is not the political will and the technical support and the equipment and the cooperation of the member states in order to make this investigation possible with scientific evidence of the 21st century, bringing strong cases that will be successful and that will achieve convictions. Without these conditions, we will be unable to succeed. So I finish here, and we can come back to any of these issues to your desire according to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. I hope you can see me now.
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much. It's extremely important to have someone like you with this experience to educate us, because it's the details that you know about in the systems that are so important. And unless you have practical experience, it's very difficult to develop and make something to address those issues. And of course, I was Kofi Annan's representative in Rome when we negotiated the agreement on the International Criminal Court, and we will see how the court will operate now. And also, when we come to the question of Ukraine that you mentioned here, that the court does not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. And this is why I and David Crane, who was the prosecutor in the court for Sierra Leone, and Irving Kotler, former Minister of Justice of Canada, have proposed a statute for a special court that can try the crime of aggression. And that court is modelled after the Sierra Leone court that functioned very well. But I look forward to seeing you again when we come to the questions and discussions here later. It's important if you can participate then also, Dan. Thank you so much. Now the next speaker is, since Katarina is not well, it is Måns Molander, who is the Nordic Director of Human Rights Watch. Please take the floor.
Gracias. Primero, a Norma Andrade, felicidades. Muchas gracias. Lo siento, no puedo hablar español, entonces voy a hablar inglés. Gracias. Thank you very much, Hans, and thank you, Edelstam Foundation, for inviting me. I've been invited to address the question of femicide in Mexico and the question of impunity. And I like to talk a little bit generally about what we see in Mexico, and then going into what we see as the main problems and also maybe some suggestions for where we can make improvements. But first, for those who are not familiar with Human Rights Watch, we are a global advocacy and research organization working on global human rights. And we have field-based researchers in Mexico working on a broad range of human rights, including migration, but also women's rights and violence against women. And first, just a quick remark on the current government and the sitting president in Mexico. I think it's fair to say that Manuel López Obrador, the sitting president, he inherited a human rights catastrophe. It's involving extreme violence by organized crime. It's a widespread abuse by police, by military and prosecutors, and a pervasive impunity. So these problems have been there for long, but he has not done enough to address these problems. We see soldiers continue to kill civilians, and murders remain at historically high levels. So the president is not only failing to improve Mexico's human rights record, but he's also undermining progress in the sector of women's rights and other key human rights areas, like in transparency, like rule of law. And these are progress that activists in Mexico have fought for decades. But now he's seeking to concentrate power in his own hands and increase the control of the state to bring about his promised transformation of Mexico. So he labels anyone who criticizes him as neoliberal or conservative. He calls opponents corrupt, morally bankrupt, and he used these attacks, like many autocrats across the world, to silence legitimate criticism. And this has put him in confrontation with a range of critical voices, including women's rights groups, who criticize his lack of action on gender-based violence. So he claims that feminist movements are funded by the US. It's a new neoliberal movement trying to threaten democracy. The government is even seeing a feminist group as a threat, placing women's organization at the level of subversive groups and guerrillas. And those threats and this public weakening of the feminist movement is making genuine reform very, very difficult. So when it comes to femicide, it's a part of this human rights catastrophe. And femicide, as we're talking about today, is, maybe you're all familiar with the notion, but it's a strange notion for our Western European legal systems. We don't have it. It's mainly a crime that you will see in Central American states. So there are over 16 countries today that have femicide in the legislation. And it's when a woman is killed because of her gender. So it aggravates the crime of killing to something more severe. And as we heard, it's a black hole when it comes to accountability, as described by Dr. Castracena Fernandez. And it's the cotton field ruling that he mentioned, that came in 2009, was a very important case for Mexico. When it came in 2009, it led to the inclusion of femicide, or feminicidio, as they say in Mexico, in the Spanish penal code. So that's when the crime was introduced. And since then, we have had a number of countries following suit. So it's just what kind of crime are we dealing with? And last year, Mexico classified 1,004 killings as femicide. And it's up from the level of 411 in 2015. So it's more than 100% increase between 2015 and 21. And as we also heard, there's 98% impunity in these cases. And these crimes continue to happen because there is impunity. Because the perpetrator of femicide knows he can get away with it with very little chance of facing justice. But at the same time, we see many of these cases are a culmination of domestic violence that has been reported to the police. There's been several indications for the state where they could have detected and stopped the violence before reaching the case of femicide. And as you know, or may have heard, Mexico has taken a number of political steps to reduce violence against women. We see initiatives ranging from introducing a whistle or a panic button to new legislation, new institutions created. But the problem, as we from Human Rights Watch see it, is that much of these new policies and legislation have a punitive approach. Many of the solutions, they focus on the penal system, such as new pre-trial detention or higher penalties. But this punitive approach, it doesn't address the structural or the systematic problem that go beyond the individual behaviors. Because this is a general problem. And for many years, as Human Rights Watch sees it, we have seen actions being taken to prevent and address violence against women, but there's no clarity on the efficiency. We simply don't know if that's effective. So as a matter of priority, our recommendation is to look at the existing public policies to see how can they be strengthened before we create new ones. So we need monitoring, we need evaluation, we need accurate data, transparency, and we need resources. But unfortunately, we see the government moving in the other direction. There have been radical changes in which instead of maintaining programs, evaluating, correcting, they simply disappear and are replaced by new systems. One example is on women's access to economic autonomy. And there is no doubt that economic empowerment is key also for women's security. Evidence shows that when women have more economic means, they suffer less physical violence in their homes, and there are fewer femicides in their communities. But instead, we have seen how the government cut programs that strengthen women's economic independence and exposing women to greater risk of violence. One specific problem that we see is about lack of trust in institutions. Because several policies that seek to combat impunity, they start from the premise that there is trust between women and institutions, which we know is not the case. So the first thing would be to see if women are turning to the institutions for support, and if they're not doing so, to understand why and provide solutions. So according to a recent survey from 2021, as many as 78.6% of women who experience intimate partner violence, almost 80%, do not request support or file a complaint. Why? Why is that? Well, three of the most common reasons they indicate for not doing so is fear of the consequences, it's a shame, and because they don't know where to go and how to report. And this gives us very important indication what we should be working on. So the fear of consequences of going to the institution and the shame that women points out, it forces us to rethink the concept of access to justice, to understand that it goes far beyond the criminal, and the new policies must be multidimensional. We must think, where will women leave their children when they want to go to an institution to ask for support? And what about women who know that if they go to ask for support, they will return home with victims of more brutal violence? And what about women who know that if they go to an institution, they will be left without economic support? But again, we don't see this coming out of the sitting president. On the contrary, a key institution, the Institute for Social Development, which was responsible for making agreements with civil society organizations that provide protection to women in situations of violence, has been extinguished by the president. The most affected programs by this cut was the shelters. Shelters for women throughout the country that now depend almost entirely on civil society organization. So once again, the burden is put on the victim, on the women, and on the civil society. So I also want to, before ending, provide some thoughts on what could work. So it's a grim picture in the way that the problem is getting worse, and we don't see any turning points in the grim statistics. But do we see any progress? When it comes to effective measures to combat impunity, we know that apart from prevention and access to justice, special legislation is definitely needed, but that needs to be accompanied by specific law enforcement capacity building, education. And recent research in Mexico has focused on the prosecutorial reform, the prosecutor reforms in Mexico, looking at the role of state-level public prosecutors. Because the investigation of these specially designated crimes, like femicide, it depends to a large extent on the individual decisions by the prosecutor. It's important to look how the role of the prosecutor can influence the number of femicides investigated. And the research suggests that just this reform in Mexico, recent, an appointing of a special prosecutor for gender-related crimes has been successful and increased the investigation of femicide cases by 50% on average, where this has been implemented. So this is a kind of initiatives that seem to work, we need to build on to reform the system, to ensure accountability and end impunity. And we also need to pressure Mexico. And this is a little bit apart, but when we look at how we can ensure sustainable reforms, we also look at what kind of pressure points do we see, also globally. And for us as a global organization, the US is a key partner on this, or could be. Unfortunately, we have seen the Biden administration is preferring to focus on ensuring López Obrador's support to prevent migrants from reaching US, than putting pressure on Mexico to carry out genuine human rights reforms. Because there is the attacks on democracy in Mexico that undermines rule of law and human rights that the US need to be concerned about. But until we see that change, we will continue to rely on the role of civil society and the work of Norma Esther Andrade and the Nuestras Hijas de Regreso a Casa to combat violence against women and femicide in Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mons, for your important contribution here. And also, it demonstrates the important role that civil society and the non-governmental organizations like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty have to play in societies where we want to establish the rule of law. We have now come to actually the discussion already now. Would the speakers take the floor?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eva Werner Dahlin. I have been Swedish ambassador to Guatemala and to Colombia, and I have worked a lot on the issue of impunity and also with support to women's organizations all over Latin America. And I would like to start with felicitaciones a Norma por su gran trabajo, muy importante. But I would like to ask you, Carlos, to tell us a little bit about what's the situation now in Guatemala, because we know that the judges, the prosecutors, and everyone that worked with the impunity issue in Guatemala have been forced to leave the country, actually. So if you, and that's an example of what happens when the battle against impunity is very successful. So I think we have something to learn from that also. Please.
Thank you. Carlos, please.
Thank you. Yes, it's a very important point, and it's a lesson to be learned also. I think that the example of Guatemala is a clear message for everyone, for all of us. CICIG was so successful that soon the opposition was organized in inside the country to destroy this effort that was so important for ordinary people. And this kind of coalition of corrupt and members of the former regime during the civil war have been able to destroy this effort, actually. They have elected a president that had been indicted by the commission. He was indicted on crimes in the penitentiary system, but he is the president. And he has made every step to end the international cooperation. The CICIG was closed, and then the judges and the prosecutors who had helped us in the investigations and prosecution of very serious cases have been indicted. And they are persecuted, and many of them have had to leave the country, and the numbers of the martyrs and the impunity have come back to the initial situation, and obviously the international community can do nothing if the cooperation is interrupted by the receiving state, but the political pressure can be permanent. And the problem is that the donor countries that had sustained this effort during so many years did nothing in exchange of the unilateral decision to put an end to the experience. The consequence is that the government and the other institutions involved in criminal activities feel free to persecute the prosecutors and the judges without any cost internationally. And this is something we need to take into account when we arrive to places where violence is systemic, like, let's say, we can mention the Democratic Republic of Congo. The presence of the international community, the cooperation, but also the political pressure on the local authorities must be sustained in the long term, because as soon as you interrupt your effort, they come back to the previous situation, and it is like the Sisyphus myth, the stone that you, with a lot of effort, have been able to climb to the mountain, comes back to the lower part of the situation. This is what happened in Guatemala, and this is what is happening also in Ciudad Juárez and in many other places. There are efforts made by the international community to establish something that in our countries is usual, the reliability of the security and justice system, and as soon as this cooperation and political pressure is interrupted, the situation comes back to the initial case. And this is a pity, but it is something we need to amend and rectify clearly.
Thank you so much, Carlos. This is extremely interesting. And again, your contribution here with your knowledge is important, as we can understand. Someone else? Questions? Yeah?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Liliana Lopez. I came from Mexico, supporting
Your name was?
Norma. Liliana Lopez. Liliana. Professor Castrasana, you don't remember me, but I never will forget you, because you was my professor in 2000 in the first criminal law course in the Carlos III. And you and Judge Baltasar were there, so I'm really happy and honored to be here and address for second time in my life a question for you. I hope I learned a lot after your classes. I would like to know what's your opinion on how to organize the international law of cooperation in terms of criminal matters and justice. Because it seems that the criminal law precepts, the corruption precepts, and the fight against impunity, it seems they are not correlated at some point. So in some countries, as in Mexico, sometimes they are focused on aspects that are related, in this case, with femicide, but there is not the same effort in terms of law or law enforcement in terms of corruption. So how to handle these pieces of law for having a strong or at least coherent cooperation system?
Carlos, would you like to speak?
Okay. Well, I don't think it is a problem of legality. We have a legal framework. We can always improve it. We can establish new links of cooperation. But in Europe, we have the European Union and we have the Council of Europe. But in America, you have the Organization of American States and plenty of conventions on corruption, on gender violence. The question is apply them. The law is useless if those who have to respect and ensure the rights of the population do not do the job because they usually are more submitted to the pressure of powerful people, to the corruption of powerful people, as Pablo Escobar used to say, plata o plomo, so silver or bullets. In Latin America, it's very clear that the legal framework is not the main problem. The problem is political will of the authorities to enforce this legal framework that is enforced but do not apply. Women, especially in the case of Ciudad Juarez, are poor, are not influential, have not financial resources, so always the powerful people prevail. This is the situation we need to change. It was also the same situation in Guatemala. 99% of the population is honest, is decent, is expecting that the authorities protect them, but the authorities do not. And do not because they prefer the money of the corrupted groups or they prefer to turn the eyes to another place when there is threat, when there is pressure from the organized crime organizations. So this is what the international community needs to change. The status quo of the forces, providing a bigger protection for the victims and establishing some kind of deterrence for the perpetrators. As far as we do that, we will see the changes. But as soon as we leave the situation to herself, the law of the powerful will always prevail. The democracy, finally, and the rule of law is always the law of the weak. And we need to enforce the law of the weak because if not, the law of the strongest will prevail.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And I might add that corruption is one of the worst enemies of the rule of law. And we've actually started to work to create an international anti-corruption court. It's Richard Goldstone, who was the prosecutor in the Yugoslav Tribunal, Rwanda Tribunal, also a judge of the Supreme Court, of the Constitutional Court in South Africa. He is heading a team. There's an American judge, Mark Wolf, who took the initiative several years, the idea, and I'm also participating among others here. And there will be a meeting in the Netherlands where the government of the Netherlands is inviting people to come to The Hague towards the end of November to discuss the concept and see what states would like to contribute here before we formulate our direct proposal. The floor is open again. Is there? Yes, Lisa?
My name is Lisa Berg. As we...
It doesn't work.
No, it doesn't work.
Have you switched on?
Okay. So, as we've heard today about the importance of civil society, in this case, to struggle against impunity, I would very much like to hear if Norma could tell us about how her organization works in Mexico, and also if Mons could tell us a little bit of how Human Rights Watch work, if they do, together with civil society, how you could cooperate to keep the pressure on the governments So please, Norma, if you would like to tell us a little bit of your work actually in Mexico or in Ciudad.
Tolken ska ha mikrofonen. Right. Now you have this.
Bueno,
¿Sí?
He trabajado en 2 organizaciones exactamente lo mismo.
I work in 2 organizations exactly in the same way.
Nuestras hijas de regreso a casa,
Yes, nuestras hijas de regreso a casa, the first one,
conformada por familiares, madres, familiares y amigos
which included mothers and also members of families.
de jóvenes asesinadas y desaparecidas en Ciudad Juárez.
So mothers of who had a daughter who had been assassinated. So that was the people who were joining the organization at the beginning.
Un equipo de abogados de Ciudad de México.
I'm actually two, because I know it's 2, so I'm going to say 2 lawyers also joined the organization.
Que iban a Ciudad Juárez a apoyarnos con los casos
And they went to Ciudad Juárez because they were based in Mexico, and they went to Juárez and they helped the families. So the two lawyers were very important, actually.
Como mamás tuvimos que aprender a estudiar las leyes para saber.
Yeah, as mothers, we had to actually learn about law, about how to defend ourselves because we didn't know.
En base a qué artículos y cuáles eran nuestros derechos que podíamos exigir con los ministerios públicos, con los agentes de la policía.
So we had to learn how, what were the laws and all the protocols and the things that we had to follow to defend us because we didn't know.
Tuvimos que capacitarnos para aprender a extraer lo importante de los expedientes.
So we had to be actually trained to understand what sort of elements we could take out of the files, of our files to understand our rights.
Los abogados nos dejaban oficios para llevarle a las autoridades y exigirles determinadas acciones en cada expediente.
So the lawyers, they were telling us, this is what you should ask to the prosecutors, or where you're going to meet with the authorities. This is the thing that you should ask and the elements that you should follow up on.
Y nos tuvimos que sentar a las mesas de trabajo con el gobierno para sacar las investigaciones adelante.
And we were actually the one who were investigating, because we were asking the authorities to investigate with the elements that were given to us by the lawyers who were helping us.
Eso en lo que es el área de justicia.
This is the work of justice that we were doing.
Pero también teníamos otra área,
But we work on other levels as well.
que es la búsqueda de nuestras jóvenes desaparecidas.
We look for women who disappeared as well. Okay, we were working on the one who were killed, but we were looking for others as well. So part of our work was to do that.
La búsqueda la realizábamos de dos formas.
So we look for them in 2 ways.
En vida.
En vida.
En vida. O sea, buscábamos a las jóvenes en vida.
Okay, so looking for the one who were actually disappeared but not found. Yes.
Estas las hacíamos con los rostros de las jóvenes pegándolos en los postes, en los negocios, en toda la ciudad.
So for that we were actually posting, their pictures, in different parts of the city to look for them.
O yendo a los lugares donde nos decían que probablemente la habían visto.
Or in places where they've been seen, or maybe that somebody see them. Yeah.
Eso es búsqueda en vida.
Okay, so this is the woman that we were looking, the women who were actually still alive.
La búsqueda en muerte
And the other one is actually, you know, looking for dead women.
nosotros íbamos a peinar el desierto
So we were doing, it's called, how do you call it?
a buscar, a rastrear.
Yeah, so searches in the desert, you know, for looking for, you know, elements of
En un
bodies.
inicio, únicamente armadas con varillas.
So at the beginning, we only had varillas. I don't know what it is.
Las hundíamos en la tierra,
Son maybe
se hunde en la tierra.
baston. Oh.
Cuando lo sacamos, la punta tiene un aroma especial si hay algún cuerpo por los gases que despiden los cuerpos.
What? Arrows. Arrows, or I mean, I don't know exactly how to explain that, but it's a system maybe of arrows, or they were putting that in the sand, and they could feel if they could feel something, if they could find a bone, or I don't know, but part of a body. What? And the smell as well. They were trying to identify that with the smell.
Cuando la varilla nos daba algún indicio de que había ahí un cuerpo, entonces ya nosotras escarbábamos.
So where we could smell something or feel something, okay, we were trying to get out, you know, what we were going to find.
Y cuando lamentablemente llegamos a encontrar algún cuerpo, en un inicio era así, eran esqueletos.
So when sometime, you know, unfortunately we were found some bones or skeleton.
Nosotras no lo podíamos ni tocar, ni mover, ni absolutamente
So
nada.
as a family, we couldn't actually take them or touch them or do anything with them.
Hasta que llegaba una autoridad.
Before the police was coming. So we had to give it back to the police, basically.
Entonces cambiamos nuestro sistema. Las siguientes veces que íbamos, obligábamos a la autoridad a acompañarnos.
So what we did actually, we obliged the police or some team of police to come with us, so they could be with us where we were actually, you know, trying to find out what was under, you know, the piece of land that we were actually digging on.
Actualmente, ahora sí hacemos, y esto es en la segunda organización, planos.
Okay, now in the second organization that I belong to, we're a bit more organized. So we do some mapping first.
Delimitamos las áreas donde vamos a ir a buscar.
We actually delimit, you know, the places where we're going to look for something or doing our searches.
Y ahora sí llevamos el equipo. Llevamos palas, gribas, varillas.
Okay, so now they are equipped with different tools to better dig, you know, in the soil.
Ahora sí realizamos un trabajo más profesional en la búsqueda en muerte.
So now we have, I could say, you know, a more professional way of finding the dead body.
Hemos encontrado en Ciudad Juárez en 5 rastreos.
Okay, we found in Ciudad Juárez, we did 5 searches.
98 restos, huesitos.
We found 98 pieces of bones.
Ropa, balas,
clothes, bullets,
zapatos de chicas.
And the shoes of girls.
No sabemos exactamente porque la autoridad ahí sí ya no nos dice a quiénes pertenecían esos huesos. Esos restos óseos.
So the police never told us, you know, who they belong to, who the bones belong to.
En el Ajusco, en Ciudad de México,
en Ajusco, en Ciudad de México, yes.
Encontramos el año pasado
the last year
5 falanges.
¿5 qué?
5 dedos. Huesos de los dedos.
They found 5 fingers.
2 cráneos.
2 cranes.
Una cadera y un costillar.
Una cadera,
Cadera.
Una cadera, a bone, a hip, and what?
Costillas.
And cost.
Tampoco sabemos eran dos personas.
There are two, they belong to two people, two persons.
Una de ellas ya fue identificada y entregada a la madre,
One of them,
una jovencita,
one of them has been identified and the mother has been actually informed.
y la otra
And the other one, we don't know who
todavía
she
no
is.
sabemos de quién es. En nuestra búsqueda en vida hemos encontrado
We have also found
9 jovencitas
9 young girls
vivas
alive,
y tenemos una
and we have one.
posiblemente ubicada. Todavía no sabemos en qué lugar se la llevaron.
Yeah, and
Todavía no la encontramos a ella físicamente.
Okay, and we are in the process to find one. We know more or less where she is, but she has not been identified yet.
En grupo de acción
En Grupo de Acción, the second organization that she belongs to,
hay un equipo
we have a team
de 10 abogados
of lawyers
que son los encargados de llevar el caso de mi hija en la Comisión Interamericana.
and those lawyers are in charge of taking the case of my daughter to the Inter-American Commission Court.
Acabamos de ganar el caso en la Corte Interamericana de la defensora Digna Ochoa.
Yes, we just managed to get the case of Digna Ochoa at the Inter-American Court of Justice.
Que el Estado había dicho que era suicidio.
The state said that she committed suicide at the time.
Y la Corte dijo,
And la Corte
es asesinato
said
y
it's
se
not.
reabre el expediente.
Okay, and the court said, no, it's not a suicide, it's an assassination, and you need to reopen the case.
Como organización,
As an organization,
ahorita estamos buscando a
we are
3
looking,
jóvenes desaparecidas de Ciudad Juárez,
we are looking for 3 young girls who have disappeared in Ciudad Juárez,
4 de Ciudad de México,
4 in Mexico City,
un
one
hombre de Puebla.
man from Puebla.
Puebla.
One man.
Sí. 5 asesinatos de jovencitas en San Luis Potosí.
5 others in San Luis de Potosí.
Un asesinato en Morelos de un medioambientalista de Morelos.
Okay, one from
Defensor del
Morelos,
medio
and it was a man.
Defensor del medio ambiente.
Okay, so it was a defensor of the, sorry now.
Medio ambiente.
Medio ambiente, yo sé, pero, environment, thank you, yes.
Y
Environment.
se está defendiendo también la violación a los derechos humanos de un multifamiliar afectado en el sismo de 2017.
Okay, so they're upon another case that happened in 2017 as well.
Okay.
So many
Thank you very much.
cases.
Muchas gracias. Mons, I think there was a question put to you too.
Okay, thanks. I also had a question to you, how this prize affects you, or what it means for your organization, but maybe we can take that next round. But just quickly on how we work. So we are a organization that always use a methodology that we call investigate, expose, change. And investigate is field-based research. So half of our organization is researchers. So you can call them experts, or we call them researchers. They're based on the ground, often live in the country that they work in. We don't have offices in many countries, but we have presence. So it's easy for us to go in and out if the security situation gets worse. But so we do the research, and just a small comment on that. Normally, 25 years ago, it was about writing these big reports, could be 500-600 pages, long after the crime has happened. Today, everything goes so fast. So we produce almost the same day as we have crimes happening in Ukraine, for example, we need to come out with something. And we produce 2,500 products a year. So it's over 10 a day that comes out. So it's a constant production of research. We take that to the world, as we say, we expose it. We have over 5 million followers on Twitter, very important. Even if now maybe Twitter is not the same as it was, but we use LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok, social media is of course very important, but also Al Jazeera, BBC, New York Times, to put international spotlight for change. And that's the third part. And that's the difference between us and a newspaper or a media house, that we always have an agenda. We have a suggestion of what should change. And you would see it in the headline, could be 40 people killed in Egypt, and the sub-headline is our recommendation for change. A UN investigation is needed, accountability needs to happen, or something like that. So I won't go in what kind of change we see, but normally it's to prevent, stop, or accountability. That's the kind of change that we seek. But we are a very small organization compared to many others, and we need to work in close partnerships. So we do that in, for example, a country like Mexico. We're totally dependent on local organizations. We need them for, one, to identify the problems. What are the most urgent issues that we need to work on? Two, to find the victims, the witnesses, the people that we want to interview. And three, also to formulate what are the most urgent changes that need to happen, to help us formulate the right recommendations. And what we can do is to help put the international spotlight on that problem. We can go to the EU, go to the UN, go to the big powers to say that you need to make sure that this problem is resolved. And regardless if it's in Burma or Yemen or in Mexico. So we have very good access to the United Nations, to the US, to Sweden in our case, so we have direct contact with the Swedish government. We do what we call a top-level advocacy. So we don't have a big organization like Amnesty that we can use for advocacy. We're a small organization and we go directly on the decision makers. And mostly it's countries, but sometimes it's companies. And in these days, FIFA, for example. So we work a lot with FIFA because they have a big problem. So that's very short on our methodology, thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I see a hand there and one here. And one where? Yes. Please. Yes.
Thank you. Señora Norma, muchas gracias por venir aquí. Thank you very much for coming here and telling us a little bit about your very important work. I have two questions. First, to you. I have not known well the case of your daughter. Would you like to say a few words who she was, your daughter? I would like to know. And also, if you have seen any improvements in the case of the government of Mexico, have there been any steps forward for cases like this? And also, Carlos, I would like to ask you about another problem of human rights. I've been the former ambassador to Nicaragua, Chile, and Peru, and I'm following, as many other people, the situation of Nicaragua and the serious violations of human rights of men and women, of course. So I would like to know, do you have any suggestions? What more could be done? We have, for example, many women who are prisoners in very inhuman conditions in Nicaragua. Do you have any suggestions to us who are engaged in those cases? Thank you.
Thank you. Norma Esther Andrade. Followed by Carlos.
Sobre su hija, on a daughter.
Ella era Alejandra.
She was Alejandra.
Alex era mi hija la menor.
She was the youngest one, my youngest daughter.
Una defensora de sus derechos.
She was a defender of her right.
Como la ven, tenía una sonrisa en sus labios siempre.
She has an exceptional smile on her face.
Su filosofía era, si le regalas una sonrisa a alguien, él te la devuelve.
Okay, so her philosophy was if you smile to somebody, the smile will come back to you.
Siempre, siempre alegre.
She was very happy, a happy girl.
No muy buena estudiante.
She didn't study very well. She was not a good student.
Tenía una capacidad, una inteligencia muy grande,
She was very intelligent.
pero ella se dedicaba a jugar basquetbol,
She was playing basketball.
estaba en el equipo de las porras.
What is it?
Formaba parte del equipo de ajedrez,
Yes, she was playing chess.
del grupo de danza,
She was dancing. Yeah.
de oratoria en la escuela,
She was a good speaker at school, you know.
y era presidenta del club de periodismo de la escuela.
She was belonging to a club of reporters at school.
Con esas actividades no le quedaba tiempo para estudiar.
So with all that she was doing, she had no time to study.
Así que salía con 7 y 8 ella.
Y ella tenía 17 years. I mean, she was 17 years old.
Estaba enamorada del amor, de la vida.
She was really in love with love and life.
Eso la hizo tal vez cometer errores siendo una jovencita, pero eso fue algo que a ella no lo vio como un error. Alejandra
Where is the translation?
No, because I'm asking about, just missed something.
O sea, Alejandra cometió un error a los 15 años.
Yeah, okay, so Alejandra made a mistake when she was 15.
Mas ella no lo vio como un error.
But she didn't see it as a mistake.
Quedó embarazada
She got pregnant
a los 15 años.
when she was 15.
Ciudad Juárez es frontera con Estados Unidos.
Ciudad Juárez is at the border with the USA.
Yo le dije a Alejandra, te llevo a El Paso,
I said to Alejandra, if you want, I take you to El Paso,
a una clínica de aborto,
to a clinic where you can abort.
y ella dijo no.
Yeah, and she said no.
Y ella defendió la vida de su hijo, de su hija, porque fue niña, por encima de todo.
Yeah, she defended the life of her daughter because actually she was expecting a daughter.
Ahora a la distancia yo digo, qué bueno que dijo que no.
And now I'm saying, that's really good that she said no.
Porque su hija
Because her daughter,
es mi hija ahora.
it's my daughter now.
Cuando Alex es asesinada,
When Alex was assassinated,
Jade tenía 1 año 8 meses.
Radi she was 18 months old.
Y Caleb, su hijo pequeño, tenía 5 meses de nacido.
Y Caleb, which is his small son, was only 5 months old.
Oh. Well,
Fui abuela, me convertí en mamá.
So I was a grandmother and I became a mother again.
Y en sus hijos yo la veo a ella.
Y when I see the son and a daughter, I see Alejandra.
Lo más bello de ella era su sonrisa.
But the most beautiful part of her is really a smile.
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Y la segunda pregunta, and the second question, you wanted to know about Mexico.
Some progress?
Yeah, el progreso actual del gobierno.
Como bien hemos comentó Carlos,
He has been commented already by Carlos and other people here.
hay leyes, hay estructura que no había antes, hay instituciones,
So we have now laws, we have infrastructure, and we have everything.
pero en el 2001 se asesinaban a 3 mujeres por día.
But in 2001, there were 3 women killed every day.
En 2022 se asesinan a 11.
And in 2020, we have 11 women
¿Hemos
dying
mejorado?
every day.
No.
So I wouldn't say that we have progressed, really.
Thank you. Thank you. Carlos? Please.
About Nicaragua. Nicaragua is a disgraceful case where democracy becomes a dictatorship. This is a pity, and this is something we should not remain passive about. This is the situation in many other places. Guatemala is becoming a dictatorship, but the problem is that the international community lament, but really do not put the necessary pressure, and these are weak countries where some intelligent political pressure can represent really a change in business, in investment, in cooperation, in many other fields. So we need to be insisting in the human rights clause, in the cooperation with all these countries with weak institutions. They can very easily reverse the democratic approach and become dictatorships and violate human rights. But if we, the international community, do not react, the citizens in these countries become clearly unprotected. We made in the Charter of United Nations the commitment of helping people to enjoy fundamental rights all around the world. It is not only the responsibility of the governments of every territory, but also the responsibility of the international community to ensure that the human rights prevail everywhere. This is something we usually forgot, and then as a consequence, people are left apart. So we need to rectify and be more clear. The example of the World Cup in Qatar these days is a very clear example. We should never accept celebrating this kind of events in countries that clearly are not democracies and not respectful of fundamental human rights. But if we do nothing, the situation will only be worse and worse in territories that are left apart and where people is really unprotected, not only because of their governments, but because of the international community. We have invented the concept of complementarity, and this concept means that the international community must take the responsibility when domestic authorities do not perform properly.
Thank you very much. There were 2 more questions, one over there and one here. One over there first. No. Raise your hand. Thank you.
I am Natalie Persson, and I'm originally from Madagascar, but I live here in Sweden. And the first question that I had was actually already answered by Mrs. Andrade about her daughter. And my question now is for Mons, because Mons was telling about research that they are doing and with their recommendation. And I heard in one of the recommendations, education is very important, because you mentioned, for example, that women do not know where to go. They even didn't know that that was a crime. And so when coming to education, I was just thinking, now of course we are talking about really systematic changes at a higher level that impact on the country. But my thought was, when it comes to education, I know myself experience in Madagascar. I have heard lots of these women beaten by their boyfriends or by their men. And it belongs more or less, unfortunately, to think, oh, it's normal. That's the way that these men should behave, or they behave that way. Whereas girls are arguing, and men maybe, just if they think they are fed up with the argument, then they can beat you a bit, which is not acceptable. So it's included also in the mentality. So I thought that in the education, very early, boys should be aware they shouldn't touch at all any girl, any daughter, any wife. And this should be included in the education. I know we have also to talk with the policymaker how to include that in education. But I think in the long run, if you want to have responsible citizen, they have also to take that already from the beginning. You know, here when I moved here in Sweden, it's only here that I discovered that officially you are not to beat a child. You are not to beat your pupil. And I am also French. I was trained in France. I lived there. Never have I heard that. And now only French are starting also to put that in the law. And then children, they learn that now. I see my grandchildren, when they are fighting, daughters, sisters and brothers. So he's reminded this little boy, you should not touch at all your daughter. So that's what my point about education, not coming only to this organization, but it should be really included in citizen behavior. Thank you.
Thank you. Måns Molander, you got the question? And please move the microphone here.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I can answer it in a general way, you can say. I think that when it comes to women's rights and sexual reproductive health and rights, generally, it is a very difficult battle. We're actually moving backwards. So we have seen very important human rights reforms in many areas, but in the area of women's rights, we actually go backwards. We see the Roe versus Wade in the US. We have seen how populist leaders in Hungary or in Poland use the issue of women's rights as a issue to foster support. And what we've seen in Afghanistan is nothing less than a human rights crisis. It's cutting out 50% of the population from education, from the work system. So it's been a very dark year for women's rights and a dark decade, I would say. It's a long time since we had, in the 95, 96, the Cairo Platform for Action and Beijing meeting talking about the right to abortion as a human right, where you could actually see that in the United Nations document, that women had the right to a safe abortion where it's not against the law. You couldn't write that today, because populist leaders, including in Russia, are using the issue of women's rights as a way to foster support. So I think that what we have seen, we need popular reaction. We need strong counter-reaction. We need women's march. We need people go to the streets and say that we can't tolerate this. What we've seen in Iran is very important, because the demonstrations in Iran had spread internationally. We have seen large number of people take to the streets, also in Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, other countries. So that's like the prerequisite for change. And even in Mexico, some of the most recent and horrible killings in 2020 were defended by tabloid papers as this is a Cupido, like this was a victim of love, almost normalizing that kind of violence, which also led to demonstrations and public outrage, saying that this is not acceptable. We can't accept this to being something less than what it really is. It's a killing with the sole purpose of killing a person because she belongs to a certain gender. So I say that we need to have this popular mobilization, and it needs to happen more. It needs to be very much stronger. But unfortunately, we're not moving in the right direction.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad to see Carlos back on the screen again. It's important that you are with us to the very end, which is very soon. It's only some 10 minutes left. Now, next question, please.
Yes.
Sorry?
¿Puedo contestar?
She wanted to add something on the last comment.
Sorry, I missed that. Who wanted to?
No, Norma wanted to respond.
I see. Okay.
Yo propuse en la legislatura
So, talking about education, I offered to the legislation
un cambio a la currícula de educación
to change the curriculum of children,
que se incluya en la materia de género
to integrate a gender issue
desde preescolar,
from
kinder,
elementary school.
porque si los educamos a los pequeños,
Because if we educate the very small children,
probablemente en la tercera generación veamos un cambio.
maybe in the third generation we will achieve one change.
Pero me contestaron que si creía que eran enchiladas.
But they said to me that
Así me dijeron, o sea, que si creía que era algo muy fácil. O sea, por eso me dijeron, ¿usted cree que son enchiladas?
Okay. And they said, well, do you think that it's very easy to do?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Elizabeth. I have a question for you, Carlos. You mentioned very briefly whether it's domestic violence or if it's unknown persons killing the women. Are there the husbands who are the killers, or are they just men picking up women?
Well, both. There is a pattern of domestic violence. In Mexico, it's very clear. We have in our societies also. But in Latin America is prevalent. There is a lot of violence from the childhood at home, in the domestic field. Men mistreat their wives systematically, and the response from the authorities is extremely poor. It creates a situation where it is very easy for organized crime groups to continue this violence against women in an organized manner. So in Ciudad Juárez, when we investigated, we could find presence of both kinds of gender violence, the domestic violence of the husbands against his wives, that in many cases ended in femicide, but also the organized activity of criminal groups smuggling women from the U.S., from Mexico to the U.S. for exploiting sexual slavery, but also for abusing young women there. And in the case of Campo Algodonero, for example, you can imagine that it was clearly organized. It was not an accident that 8 corpses of women raped and murdered had been found in the same place. It was clearly a group that kidnapped the women, raped them, then killed them, and then throw the bodies in the very same place. And in other locations have been found also collective burials or collective abandonment of corpses, especially in the desert, which indicates clearly that it is not accidental or not individual cases, but systematic organized cases. There were also informations that established clearly that there could be another pattern of gender aggressors crossing the border to commit crimes against young Mexican women, because for some reasons El Paso, Texas was a place where the American authorities had decided to confine sexual aggressors who had committed the crime in different places in the US and had served their penalties in prison, but when they were finally freed after the punishment of the penalty correspondent, they were confined in El Paso. And several of these women cross the border every day or 1 or 2 times a week to use the service of prostitution, but in some cases also kidnapping and raping women in Ciudad Juárez. Also, there were different cases with different origins. In some cases were domestic violence, but in others were clearly organized violence.
Thank you so much. And we have now come to the time for closing. Before I do that and say thanks, I will present a gift, a little gift to Norma Esther Andrade. But first I will show it to Carlos. So I'm going to show it by putting up in front of the camera. Huh? Have you taken away the camera? Was it there? Okay. There. Can you see, Carlos?
Not right now.
Is it this one? No, David.
Sorry, Carlos.
Can't you see?
No.
did you shut off the camera?
Now you can see it. Okay, okay.
You see it?
Yes, very dark, but I can see it.
Ah, okay. So, that's better. Anyway, what this is something very important, because the whole discussion this afternoon has very much turned on the question of the need for the rule of law. Kofi Annan, with whom I worked in the UN, he was not a lawyer, but he understood better than the lawyers that the rule of law is necessary for international peace and security. And therefore, when I was invited by the Interaction Council of former heads of state and government in 2008 to advise them in their annual meeting, I started talking about the rule of law. The oldest participant there was Helmut Schmidt, former Chancellor of Germany, 90 years old. And when I started talking about the rule of law, he said, I wonder if politicians understand their responsibility for the rule of law. And this gave me the idea, and I asked the Raoul Wallenberg Institute in Lund in Sweden and the Hill Institute in the Netherlands to elaborate a guide for politicians on the rule of law. Not long, and it shouldn't cost anything. This guide was published in 2012, and it is now available on the web in 26 languages, with more to come, for printing from the web, some 40 pages, as I said. So it is called Rule of Law, a Guide for Politicians. If you Google those words, you will find it. Or if you Google my name, you will find it on my website. But here, I'm going to give this one to Norma. El Estado de Derecho, guía para políticos. So I hope that you will spread this message in Mexico. And since it's in Spanish, of course, Carlos, you may have heard about it, but it's important, yes. Thank you. Now, then it falls to me to thank all those who have contributed here. Of course, Caroline, of course, thank you so much for organizing this meeting. And also Lisa Berry, who greeted us, and who is the vice chair of the foundation. And then, of course, Carlos, your contribution was extremely welcome here and so important, in particular because of your very solid knowledge of all the issues that we discussed here. And of course, Mons also is important because, as I said, the non-governmental organizations have a very important role to play. So I will thank you, and thank you all, and also our interpreter for assisting us. I think that's very important. Yeah. And one thing that I never forget to mention when I talk about the rule of law are the elements that are necessary for the rule of law. And first of all, it's democracy. Why? Because the second element is proper legislation that is reflecting also the international standards in the field of the rule of law. And proper legislation you have only in a democracy where the elected legislate, and we have secret elections that people can vote without disclosing their voting. It's very important. It's one of the elements of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The third element, that's the institutions to administer this law, including impartial and independent courts. And then we come to the fourth element, which I have learned very much about, and also discussing this in the world. The persons with the integrity and the knowledge to administer these institutions. Because if you don't have that, then it won't work. And when I represented Kofi Annan in Mérida in Mexico, I read out his statement, but with his permission, I added an appeal to judges all around the world. Because if a judge is corrupt, he or she ruins all other efforts at the national level to root out corruption. So it's so important. But I think we have had an interesting, very interesting afternoon. Thank you all for your contributions, and may God be with you. Thank you.